I was standing barefoot on the hardwood floor of our bedroom, holding a navy silk dress against my body, trying to decide whether it looked confident enough for a 10th anniversary gala, when my phone started vibrating on the dresser. I almost ignored it. It was mid-morning on a Thursday, and Maggie never called during business hours unless it was something small and logistical. I smiled at my reflection, smoothed the fabric over my hips, and let it buzz twice before I picked it up. "Hey, Max." "Becca," she interrupted, her voice lower than usual, controlled, careful. "I need you to listen to me without reacting." Something inside me tightened. "Okay." "There's an account linked to Daniel's profile that triggered a compliance alert this morning." I had to freeze it. I frowned automatically. "What account?" "We only have the joint checking and the brokerage." Silence. Then she said the words that made the room feel like it tilted. "It's connected to the Lawson family trust." My grip on the dress loosened. The silk slid from my shoulder to the floor. "And the most recent charge," Maggie continued, each word deliberate, "was just under $20,000. Private cliffside estate. Santorini. 7 nights. Honeymoon package." I hadn't booked a trip to Greece, and I wasn't planning any honeymoon. I lowered myself onto the edge of the bed, staring at the sunlight cutting across the rug. "That doesn't make any sense," I said, though my voice sounded distant to my own ears. Maggie exhaled softly. "I can't disclose everything." "Becca. Compliance rules." But the activity pattern flagged as structured international movement. "It's not a one-off." "Structured how?" "Incremental transfers over the past several months. Below standard reporting thresholds." The Santorini charge was the largest and the most visible. My mind tried to catch up. "Daniel handles investment management for the trust." "But he can't just—" I stopped. "Could he? Did you authorize expanded international liquidity rights?" she asked carefully. "No," I said immediately, then hesitated. "At least, I don't think so." She didn't respond to that. "The freeze is temporary pending review. Do not confront him yet. Get your documents. Review your amendments. Call independent counsel if you need to." The word independent echoed. When we hung up, I didn't move for a full minute. The house felt too quiet. Downstairs, I could hear the faint hum of the dishwasher. Daniel was still upstairs in his home office, probably preparing slides for tonight's gala, where he would toast a decade of partnership and growth. I stood and walked to the built-in bookshelf in the hallway, where the leather-bound trust binder sat between old photo albums. My father had established the Lawson Family Trust after selling his commercial real estate portfolio. It was supposed to be protective, structured, thoughtful, designed to shield my inheritance from business volatility, from lawsuits, from divorce risk, from exactly the kind of exposure Maggie's voice had just suggested. I carried the binder to the dining table and opened it slowly. The original formation documents were exactly as I remembered. I was primary beneficiary. Daniel was granted limited administrative authority for investment execution. Nothing more. No unilateral control. No beneficiary changes without dual authentication. I flipped to the Amendments tab. There were more pages than I remembered. An amendment dated 11 months ago had expanded administrative authority for international investment diversification. I scanned the signature line. My name was there. My signature. I closed my eyes, searching my memory. 11 months ago. That would have been during the lead-up to Daniel's Series C funding round. He'd been stressed, distracted, insistent that paperwork needed to be streamlined to satisfy investor expectations. I pulled out my tablet and searched my email archive for DocuSign confirmations. I found one time-stamped at 9:42 at night during a charity fundraiser his firm hosted. I remembered that night vaguely, balancing a wine glass. Greeting investors. Daniel pulling me aside to say, "Just sign this so we don't slow anything down." Compliance housekeeping. He'd called it. The document trail showed my electronic signature. But the IP address originated from his office network, not my device. And the amendment included language about liquidity management prior to restructuring events. Restructuring events. My chest felt tight. I logged into the trust's online dashboard. The transaction history loaded slowly. There they were, recurring international wires over the past 6 months. Each one modest enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. Each one labeled with vague descriptions. Strategic allocation. Mediterranean holdings. Pre-event deployment. Then the final entry. Aegean Cliffs Private Estate. 7 nights. Honeymoon package. My eyes moved to the notes field. Investor relations retreat. A secondary guest initial appeared next to the reservation details. C. Olivia Crane. Daniel's marketing director. I stared at the initials until they blurred. I didn't feel the sharp stab of jealousy I might have expected. What I felt instead was a cold awareness spreading through my body. He hadn't just planned a secret trip. He had positioned my family trust to fund it. And if Maggie's tone was any indication, this wasn't a spontaneous indulgence. It was structured, layered, timed. Upstairs. I heard Daniel's footsteps crossing the hallway. I closed the binder carefully, aligning the edges. For the first time since our wedding day, I realized there might be documents in my life with my name on them that I did not fully control. The freeze hadn't just stopped a payment to a private villa in Santorini. It had exposed something that had been moving quietly beneath my marriage for months. I didn't sleep that night. After Daniel went upstairs and closed the bedroom door, I stayed at the dining table with the trust binder open in front of me, the kitchen lights too bright against the dark windows. My coffee had gone cold, but I kept wrapping my hands around the mug like it could steady me. The amendment tab was thicker than I remembered. I flipped past the original formation documents my parents had signed when I was 25. Back when my father sold his commercial real estate firm and insisted the inheritance be protected from markets and from men. At the time, I had laughed at that second part. Daniel had laughed too. The amendment dated 11 months earlier was neatly notarized. My name appeared on the signature line. So did Daniel's? The language expanded his administrative authority to include international transfers for investment diversification and liquidity management prior to restructuring events. Restructuring events? I read that phrase 3 times. I didn't remember signing anything described that way. I retrieved my tablet and searched my archived digital signatures. There it was. A DocuSign envelope from late last summer. Time-stamped at 9:42 at night. I remembered the evening vaguely. We had been at a fundraising reception for Daniel's company. I had been wearing heels that hurt, smiling at investors I barely knew. Daniel had leaned close and said, "Babe, I just need you to approve this compliance housekeeping thing before the quarter closes." I had signed without reading carefully. I trusted him. The audit log attached to the document caught my attention. The IP address wasn't from my phone. It originated from Daniel's office network. My stomach tightened. 2 signatures appeared under my name, one for the amendment itself and another for a trustee acknowledgement. The timestamps were only seconds apart. I tried to remember physically tapping twice. I couldn't. I texted Maggie with what I framed as a hypothetical question about how digital amendments were verified. She called instead. "Chain of custody logs can be audited," she said carefully. "If you're worried about execution integrity, get independent counsel. Don't tip him off yet." I stared at the document while she spoke. The amendment had quietly shifted the trustee designation. Originally, Daniel and I were co-trustees with equal administrative oversight. Under the amendment, Daniel was listed as primary administrative trustee, with expanded discretion over cross-border transfers. That change required informed consent. Had I given it, or had I been maneuvered into it? I logged into the trust's investment dashboard. I had rarely checked it personally over the past year because Daniel assured me he was optimizing allocations. Several outgoing wires populated the transaction history. They were all just under common regulatory reporting thresholds, each labeled as international allocation or pre-event positioning. My pulse began to climb as I opened the detailed ledger. Recurring transfers to an entity called Mediterranean Holdings, LLC. I opened a new browser tab and searched public records. Mediterranean Holdings was registered in Delaware 3 months after the amendment was signed. The registered agent was Harold Kent, our family attorney, the same attorney who had drafted the trust amendment. I leaned back in my chair, feeling something cold replace the earlier shock. This wasn't impulsive. It was structured. I cross-referenced Daniel's travel calendar with the transfer dates. Each withdrawal aligned with a supposed investor meeting in New York, Miami, or Chicago. There was no record yet of Greece travel. But the Santorini villa charge was the largest single transaction in the ledger, and it was labeled as Investor Relations Retreat. I opened the event invitation for our anniversary gala that still sat in my inbox. 2 weeks from now. Daniel had marked a gap on our shared calendar titled Strategic Offsite. That was the same week as the Santorini reservation. My chest tightened. But not from heartbreak. From calculation. If he intended to file for divorce, timing mattered. If assets were repositioned before filing, classification during proceedings could shift. My parents had created the trust to shield inheritance from business volatility and marital disputes, and now it appeared the trust itself had been repositioned ahead of something. My phone buzzed again. "Maggie, I can't say much," she said, her voice lower this time. But the freeze triggered a preliminary review. The pattern resembles asset shielding behavior before litigation events. If he files while funds are offshore, clawback becomes complicated. I swallowed. "Did you authorize international liquidity movements tied to a personal retreat?" she asked. "No," I said. The word steady. After we hung up, I closed the binder and sat very still. Upstairs, I heard Daniel moving around, humming faintly as he dressed for work. I wondered how long he had been planning. I wondered whether the Santorini villa was a celebration, an escape, or a signing ceremony for something far larger. For the first time in our marriage, I realized I didn't know the answer. And that uncertainty frightened me less than the possibility that my future had already been repositioned without my knowledge. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and polished glass. And from the outside, we looked like the perfect couple. Daniel's company logo shimmered across a massive digital screen behind the stage, and servers moved through the crowd balancing trays of champagne. I stood beside him near the entrance, smiling as investors congratulated us on 10 years of partnership. He kept his hand at the small of my back, steady and possessive, as if nothing in our world had shifted. Olivia Crane stood 3 feet away. She wore a sleek ivory dress that was professional enough to be defensible and fitted enough to be deliberate. Every time Daniel laughed, her eyes flickered toward him first, not the person he was speaking to. Every time an investor asked a question about European expansion, she stepped half a pace closer. I watched without blinking. When Daniel took the stage, he spoke about growth, transparency, and bold expansion into Mediterranean markets. A slide appeared behind him labeled Mediterranean Strategic Deployment. My breath stalled for half a second. The timeline on the slide aligned precisely with the week of the Santorini reservation. "Relationship building is everything," Daniel said smoothly into the microphone. "You don't secure international capital over email. You do it face to face." Polite laughter followed. Olivia later joined him for the financial projections. She clicked through charts outlining liquidity flexibility and temporary capital optimization. The phrasing felt too familiar. I had seen similar language in the trust amendment. Liquidity management prior to restructuring events. When the applause died down, I excused myself and stepped onto the terrace overlooking the harbor. The night air was warm, heavy with salt and music drifting through open doors. Olivia followed a moment later. "Rebecca," she said with a bright smile. "Beautiful event. Isn't it?" "It is," I replied. Daniel mentioned a Mediterranean retreat. Santorini, right? Her expression didn't flicker. Not surprise. Not guilt. "Yes," she said easily. "Investor relations." "You're not coming." I held her gaze. I hadn't heard that it was confirmed. "Oh." She hesitated only a fraction of a second. "Daniel said your schedule might not allow it." My stomach tightened. But my voice remained calm. "Did he—" "It's important for leadership to present unity overseas," she added carefully. especially with valuation discussions coming up. Unity. That word echoed louder than betrayal. She spoke like a strategist, not a mistress. When she returned inside, I stayed on the terrace and stared out at the dark water. This wasn't just an affair hidden behind romance. This was corporate positioning disguised as travel. Back home later that night, after Daniel had fallen asleep, I reopened the trust dashboard. I overlaid transaction dates with the company's public funding announcements. Each transfer from the trust preceded a valuation milestone. Every time the company declared strong liquidity metrics, trust funds had quietly flowed into Mediterranean holdings days earlier. Temporary liquidity inflation. My hands trembled, not from jealousy, but from realization. If investors believed the company's liquidity position reflected independent corporate strength while trust funds were being cycled through, the exposure wasn't emotional. It was regulatory. I searched further. Mediterranean Holdings registration documents listed Harold Kent as registered agent. That detail alone felt like a warning bell. The Santorini charge was the largest and most visible transaction in the pattern. Reckless compared to the quiet structuring that had come before. My mind replayed something else. 6 months earlier, Daniel had suggested we discuss a post-nuptial agreement for clarity. I had laughed it off, telling him we weren't that couple. He had insisted it was just prudent planning. I declined. Now I wondered whether that refusal had accelerated something. Near midnight, Daniel's phone buzzed on the nightstand. He rolled over and stepped quietly out to the balcony to take the call. I stayed still, listening through the cracked bedroom door. His voice was low. "If the freeze isn't lifted by next week, we accelerate the filing," he said. "We can't let this stall the round." Filing. Not retreat. Not vacation. Filing. The word landed like a stone. I lay back against the pillows and stared at the ceiling, feeling something inside me settle into cold clarity. Santorini was never about romance. It was a cover for timing. A final maneuver before paperwork was submitted, assets repositioned, and narratives rewritten. And if he believed I would remain unaware until the plane took off, he had miscalculated one crucial variable. The freeze had happened first. I stood in the hallway, just out of sight, while Daniel's voice drifted in from the balcony. "If we accelerate the filing, we need everything clean before review expands," he said quietly. "I don't want exposure beyond the trust layer." Exposure. Trust layer. The words felt clinical, stripped of emotion. He wasn't arguing with a lover. He was coordinating a strategy. When he stepped back inside, he smiled at me as if nothing had shifted. "Long day tomorrow," he said, kissing my forehead. "We'll talk about Santorini logistics this weekend." I nodded and watched him walk into the bathroom. The next morning, Maggie asked me to meet her in person. The conference room at her bank branch was neutral and cold, glass walls frosting halfway up for privacy. She closed the door behind us and folded her hands on the table. "I can't disclose specifics tied to internal reporting," she said carefully. "But the pattern resembles pre-litigation asset repositioning." My pulse remained steady. "Litigation as in divorce. Or civil exposure," she replied. "International liquidity movement tied to a domestic restructuring event raises red flags." Domestic restructuring. The same language from the amendment. She slid a sheet of paper toward me. It wasn't a full report, just a high-level summary. The Santorini vendor flagged the charge because the beneficiary designation on the linked trust was listed as pending adjustment. I blinked. "Beneficiary adjustment. Pending?" she repeated. "That's all I can say." When I got home, I logged back into the trust portal and navigated beyond the transaction ledger. There, under administrative updates, was a draft entry I had never seen. Beneficiary adjustment, conditional secondary. The draft listed Mediterranean Holdings LLC as a conditional beneficiary under defined triggering events. My hands went cold. If finalized, that change could reclassify portions of the trust's distributions under corporate contingency planning. In a divorce proceeding, it could complicate what was clearly marital asset protection. I checked the submission status. Draft prepared. awaiting dual authentication confirmation. Dual authentication required both trustee signatures, mine and Daniel's. I didn't remember initiating any such change. I called Harold Kent's office and requested an urgent meeting. His office smelled faintly of leather and old books. Controlled and deliberate like everything about him. He greeted me with polite surprise. "Rebecca, what brings you in on such short notice?" "I'd like to review the pending beneficiary adjustment attached to my trust," I said evenly. For a fraction of a second, his composure slipped. "That's part of a broader strategic framework Daniel and I discussed," he replied smoothly. "Contingency planning in the event of founder separation." "Founder separation. That's a corporate phrase," I said. "Not a marital one." He folded his hands. "In high-growth companies, personal and professional transitions intersect. Asset insulation protects all parties." "Did I approve Mediterranean Holdings as a conditional beneficiary?" "You signed the amendment granting expanded authority." "That's not what I asked." Silence lingered between us. "Daniel represented that you were aligned with the strategic repositioning," Harold said carefully. "Aligned. So you relied on his representation instead of confirming mine?" I asked. His jaw tightened. "The documents reflect proper execution." I leaned forward. Dual authentication logs show irregular sequencing. My signatures were time-stamped seconds apart from his network. That's not standard practice. For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker in his eyes. On the drive home, memories resurfaced with sharper edges. 6 months earlier, Daniel had insisted we update documents before the Series C funding round. "Investors want clarity," he'd said. "We can't look disorganized." I had signed while distracted, trusting that housekeeping meant exactly that. Now the date of that amendment aligned precisely with the first transfer to Mediterranean Holdings. The lie had not been spontaneous. It had been structured. I met with a forensic accountant Maggie quietly recommended. We reviewed the ledger together. "These transfers appear cyclical," he said. "Tapping the screen. Funds move out of the trust shortly before valuation announcements. Then repositioned. Temporary liquidity inflation," I asked. He nodded slowly. "It could be interpreted that way if challenged. If investors believed trust funds were being used to signal corporate solvency, scrutiny wouldn't stop at a frozen account. It would expand." That evening, Daniel received an email notification. I saw the subject line reflected in his glasses as he opened his laptop. "Funding committee delay. Compliance review pending." He exhaled sharply. "It's because of the freeze," he muttered. He didn't know I understood the architecture now. Santorini wasn't a romantic getaway. It was the final signature stop in a carefully engineered exit. And the freeze had cracked the entire structure open. I chose his office for the confrontation. Not the kitchen table. Not the bedroom where we had once whispered about vacations and children and retirement. If this was about control, then it would happen where he felt most powerful. The conference room overlooked the Charleston skyline. Glass walls reflecting the harbor in fractured lines. Daniel stood at the head of the long table. Sleeves rolled up. Laptop open. He looked confident. Focused. He thought we were meeting to strategize about the funding delay. "Before we get into investor messaging," I said evenly, taking a seat across from him, "we need to talk about the Lawson family trust." For a fraction of a second, his jaw tightened. Then he smiled. "Is this about the freeze?" Maggie overreacted. "It's just a compliance misunderstanding." I placed 3 printed sheets on the table between us. The beneficiary adjustment draft. The Mediterranean Holdings registration. The amendment expanding his authority. His smile thinned. "When were you planning to tell me," I asked calmly, "that my family trust was about to list an LLC as a conditional beneficiary?" Silence filled the room, thick and unmistakable. "It was temporary insulation," he said finally. "Standard asset protection ahead of corporate restructuring." "Restructuring the company," I replied, holding his gaze. "Or restructuring the marriage." The air shifted. He leaned back slowly, folding his arms. "You're being dramatic." "Am I?" He exhaled sharply. Becca, the company is entering a volatile phase. Investors don't like instability. I needed flexibility. Flexibility to file for divorce after Santorini. I asked. That did it. His composure cracked just enough. I was going to file, he admitted, after the trip. Once the funding round stabilized, the words landed without the violence I might have expected. They felt clinical, planned. You are going to move trust assets, inflate liquidity perception, secure valuation, and then serve me papers, I said. That's not what this is. He shot back. This is protecting what we built. What you built? I asked quietly. My inheritance funded your protection. He stood and walked to the window, running a hand through his hair. You don't understand how these rounds work. Temporary capital positioning is normal. It's strategic. Strategic structuring below reporting thresholds. I asked. Strategic beneficiary changes. He turned toward me, eyes sharp now. You've been digging? Yes. He stared at me for a long moment, calculating. Then I said the one thing he didn't expect. The account is under federal review. His posture shifted. Review doesn't mean charges, he said quickly. I retained a forensic accountant, I continued, ignoring the deflection. The transfer pattern suggests temporary liquidity inflation. If investors discover trust funds were used to signal solvency, they won't, he interrupted. You can't guarantee that. Silence again. You've jeopardized everything, he said, voice lower now. If this spirals, the company collapses. Our net worth collapses. Our net worth, I echoed. You mean the assets you were repositioning ahead of filing? He stepped closer to the table. Olivia doesn't know about the trust structure. The Santorini trip was framed as investor relations. She's not part of this. I studied his face. So the affair was either collateral damage or convenient cover. Either way, it wasn't the core of the scheme. Mediterranean Holdings was set up to hold assets temporarily, he admitted. If things became adversarial, the word settled between us like a signed contract. You prepared for war, I said quietly. I prepared for uncertainty. You prepared to leave me financially exposed. He looked away. I leaned forward slightly. Any filing triggers immediate contest of amendment validity. Any further attempt to move funds escalates the review. You don't control the timeline anymore. His eyes snapped back to mine. What are you saying? I'm saying, I replied evenly, that the trust's original formation documents still designate me as majority beneficial interest holder. 51% influence on trust-related equity decisions. His brow furrowed. I've read every clause, I added. Have you? For the first time since we walked into that room. He didn't have an immediate answer. He had assumed control through paperwork I barely reviewed. He had assumed I wouldn't look deeper. He had assumed silence. We can still keep this quiet, he said finally. We negotiate a post-nuptial agreement. You withdraw challenges. I stabilize the board. We move on without public damage. Before I could answer, my phone vibrated on the table. A message from Maggie. The board has been notified of compliance concerns. I locked the screen without showing him. He watched my face, trying to read it. You thought Santorini would be your clean exit, I said softly. But the freeze happened first. Outside the glass walls, the harbor shimmered in afternoon light. Inside, the foundation beneath him was shifting. And this time, I wasn't the one losing balance. The board meeting notice arrived 48 hours later. Daniel tried to act as if it were routine, forwarding the email to me with a single line, standard governance check. Nothing unusual, but I saw the CC list. Lead investor, outside counsel, compliance division. It wasn't routine. It was containment. The atmosphere in the house shifted overnight. Daniel stopped mentioning Santorini. He stopped saying filing. He spoke instead about narrative alignment and investor reassurance. I said very little. The morning before the meeting, I sat in the forensic accountant's office reviewing his preliminary findings. He adjusted his glasses and pointed to the ledger timeline. "There's a pattern here," he said calmly. "Funds leave the trust shortly before valuation disclosures. Then internal liquidity appears stronger during funding communications. Temporary liquidity inflation," I said. He nodded once. "If interpreted aggressively." My throat felt dry. "And the beneficiary adjustment, inconsistent with standard fiduciary practices," he replied. "Particularly if the primary beneficiary was not fully informed. If challenged formally, the amendment could be voided. If voided, the transfers could be classified as unauthorized." Unauthorized sounded dangerous. Daniel called me twice before the board meeting began. I let the calls go to voicemail. When I arrived at headquarters, the executive floor felt colder than usual. The boardroom glass reflected the skyline and the faint tremor in Daniel's jaw when he saw me enter. "You didn't need to come," he muttered under his breath. "Yes, I did," I replied. The meeting opened with outside counsel addressing the compliance alert. The words suspicious activity and structured liquidity were spoken without drama, but they landed heavily in the room. Daniel framed it as a temporary misalignment between personal and corporate investment channels. No funds were misappropriated, he insisted. All movements were strategic. One of the investors leaned forward. "Were trust assets used to signal liquidity ahead of valuation announcements?" Daniel hesitated half a second too long. I felt every eye shift toward me. "Rebecca," outside counsel said evenly, "did you knowingly authorize expanded beneficiary designation and international liquidity participation under the trust?" The silence stretched. "No," I said clearly. "I did not knowingly authorize structural changes that reassigned conditional beneficiary rights or repositioned assets in advance of a filing event." Daniel's head snapped toward me. Outside counsel opened a folder and projected the original trust formation clause onto the screen. I had read it dozens of times since the freeze, but seeing it enlarged in the boardroom made it feel like armor. Primary beneficial interest holder: Rebecca Lawson. Voting influence: 51% on material equity-linked decisions. Dual authentication required for beneficiary modification. The compliance officer dialed in remotely confirmed that the authentication logs showed irregular sequencing. 2 signatures, seconds apart, originating from the same network source. A murmur moved through the room. The lead investor spoke again. "Until an independent audit concludes, we suspend the funding round." Daniel inhaled sharply. "That's an overreaction. It's governance," the investor replied. A motion was introduced to restrict Daniel's authority over cross-border financial movements pending review. The exact authority he had exercised through the trust. The vote passed. Daniel remained CEO, but with oversight. The meeting adjourned in silence. In the parking garage, he caught up to me. "You've just jeopardized everything," he said, his voice low but shaking. "If this collapses, we both lose." "Not if I separate cleanly," I replied. He stared at me like he was seeing someone unfamiliar. Harold stepped back. He added abruptly, "Conflict concerns." Of course he had. Attorneys rarely stand too close to fault lines. That evening, Maggie called with an update. "The review is still preliminary," she said. "No criminal referral. Yet, but documentation is being examined." I stepped out onto our balcony and looked at the harbor lights flickering against the dark water. A new email notification appeared on Daniel's phone, visible through the glass door. Santorini reservation status. Pending account resolution. The villa was still on hold. The escape plan was suspended in midair. Daniel believed control meant moving money quietly across borders, assuming no one would trace the clauses he barely read. He never realized control was written into a line he underestimated. And for the first time since the freeze, I understood that this was no longer about catching him. It was about reclaiming what had always legally been mine. Daniel asked to meet without lawyers. He chose a quiet restaurant overlooking the harbor, the kind of place where deals were made in low voices over polished wood and candlelight. 6 months ago, I would have mistaken the setting for romance. Now I recognized strategy. He was already seated when I arrived. Jacket folded neatly beside him. Posture composed. He didn't stand to kiss my cheek. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I'm here," I replied, taking the seat across from him. He didn't waste time. "We don't have to destroy each other," he began. "There's a way to settle this quietly." Settle. The word felt like a business term, not a marital one. He slid a folder across the table. "I'm prepared to offer you a substantial lump sum payout," he said evenly. "You keep the house. We file mutually. Non-disclosure on both sides. No public contest of the amendment. And in return," I asked, "you withdraw your challenge. You publicly affirm that the trust participation was authorized and strategic. The board stabilizes. The audit concludes without escalation." There it was. Silence in exchange for structure. "What happens?" I asked calmly. "If the audit uncovers intentional liquidity inflation," he hesitated. "It won't be framed that way." "That wasn't my question." He exhaled slowly. "The trust funds were used as temporary collateral for a short-term credit line," he admitted. "It was never meant to be permanent." Collateral. My inheritance had been leveraged without my informed consent. The betrayal sharpened. Not emotionally, but structurally. "You put my family trust behind corporate risk exposure," I said quietly. "It was secured," he replied quickly. "The credit facility was short duration." "You didn't ask?" "I didn't think you'd understand the urgency." The audacity would have stunned me once. Now it clarified everything. "I've retained independent counsel," I said, folding my hands on the table. "We are contesting amendment validity. Dual authentication irregularities are documented." His jaw tightened. "If the amendment is voided," I continued, "every transfer executed under expanded authority becomes unauthorized. That would damage both of us," he said sharply. "No," I replied. "It damages you." He leaned back, studying me differently now. "You're willing to burn this down." "I'm willing to secure what was never yours to leverage." He glanced toward the harbor, where boats drifted under the fading light. "Olivia has requested reassignment," he said suddenly. "She's stepping back from the European expansion." I didn't react. "She retained her own counsel," he added. "She doesn't want to be implicated." So even she had recognized the structural instability. This was never about her, I said quietly. He looked almost tired then. "What do you want?" "Becca." "Control?" "Clarity." "Security." But I didn't say those words. "I want the beneficiary adjustment draft formally withdrawn," I said instead. "Public acknowledgement to the board that trust funds will not be used in corporate liquidity representation. Immediate restriction of your cross-border financial authority. And binding divorce mediation under independent oversight." He absorbed each condition without interruption. "And one more thing," I added. His eyes narrowed. "A defined percentage of your personal founder shares transferred into a protective vehicle under my control." "That's excessive," he said immediately. "It's proportional. If the company rebounds, it secures my position regardless of volatility." He was silent for a long time. "You're dismantling my leverage," he said quietly. "You dismantled mine first." The waiter approached, neither of us ordered. "You're going to destroy my reputation," he said finally. "I'm preventing further exposure." His shoulders sagged slightly, the first visible crack in months of calculated posture. "You once said you trusted me," he murmured. "I trusted you with love," I replied. "Not with invisibility." Days later, mediation began. The beneficiary adjustment was formally rescinded. The amendment's expanded authority clause was placed under review. Board oversight of cross-border transactions was confirmed. Daniel agreed to step back from direct control over European expansion pending audit conclusion. The Santorini reservation remained on hold. Piece by piece, the escape plan unraveled. Late one evening, after the preliminary settlement terms were signed, I logged into the trust portal. Administrative authority: Rebecca Lawson, sole acting trustee pending final review. I exhaled slowly. Then, almost without thinking, I opened the vendor portal for the Santorini villa. The reservation was still active under temporary hold. Primary guest, Rebecca Lawson. He had planned to leave me standing on the shore while he sailed toward a private horizon. He never imagined I would end up owning the dock. 6 months later, the audit closed without sirens. No criminal charges. No dramatic headlines. Just a formal reprimand for governance failures and a permanent restructuring of executive authority. Daniel stepped down as CEO under pressure from the board. He retained minority founder shares, but he no longer controlled liquidity decisions. Cross-border transfers, or narrative. The funding round resumed under new oversight. Our divorce mediation finalized quietly in a downtown conference room with neutral walls and too much air conditioning. The beneficiary adjustment was rescinded. The contested amendment was modified to restore full administrative authority to me. My family trust returned to its original purpose. Protection. When I walked out of the courthouse with the signed settlement in my bag, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. For weeks afterward, the Santorini reservation remained in a suspended status, neither canceled nor confirmed. The vendor had extended the hold once the account freeze lifted, waiting for updated payment confirmation. One evening, sitting alone at my kitchen island, I logged into the portal again. Aegean Cliffs Private Estate. 7 nights. Cliffside Infinity Terrace overlooking the caldera. Primary guest, Rebecca Lawson. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I changed the guest details to one person. Me. The flight felt different when it was booked under my own decision. No secrecy. No staging. No hidden structuring beneath it. When I arrived in Santorini, the air was dry and bright. The whitewashed buildings stacked like folded paper against the blue of the Aegean Sea. The villa staff greeted me by name. "Welcome." "Me, Lawson," the concierge said with a warm smile. "We've been expecting you." Expecting me? Not as someone's wife. Not as an accessory to a retreat. Not as a placeholder before filing paperwork. As the primary guest. The terrace overlooked the water in a quiet curve of cliffs. I stood there that first evening, watching the sun lower into the horizon, the light turning gold against the sea. This was the view that had once been positioned as the backdrop to my erasure. Instead, it became the backdrop to my clarity. I thought about the freeze, about the moment Maggie's voice had cut through my certainty and forced me to look at documents I had once signed without reading, about how easily trust had blurred into invisibility. The most dangerous part hadn't been Olivia. It hadn't even been the planned divorce. It had been the assumption that I didn't need to understand the structure beneath my own life. Sitting at the long stone table outside the villa, I opened my laptop and logged into the trust dashboard. Administrative authority. Rebecca Lawson. Sole acting trustee. I reviewed the balance, the allocations, the compliance notes. Everything was transparent now. Controlled. Documented. The remaining credit from the villa booking had been adjusted after the freeze and reinstatement. I authorized the final payment from the trust under my own credentials. Watching the confirmation screen populate, for the first time in months, I felt no surge of anger. Revenge. I realized, didn't look like destruction. It looked like understanding the fine print before someone else rewrote it. Daniel's name surfaced occasionally in industry articles discussing leadership transition and governance reform. He relocated temporarily to another state. We communicated through attorneys and calendar invites. I did not stalk his social media. I did not ask about Olivia. Their roles in my story had diminished to context. What remained was structure. One evening, as the sky deepened into violet and the sea turned almost black beneath it, I thought about the word he had used. Restructuring. He had meant it as a maneuver. For me, it became a reclamation. I restructured my trust. I restructured my boundaries. I restructured my understanding of partnership. The next morning, I walked along the cliff path before sunrise. The wind was cool, and the island was quiet except for distant waves striking stone. I realized something simple and unshakable. He had believed the perfect secret account would guarantee a flawless escape. He had believed every transaction was invisible. He had believed Santorini would be the beginning of a new chapter written without me. He never imagined that a frozen account would stop the plane before takeoff. He never imagined I would read the clauses he skimmed. And he never imagined I would choose my own horizon. If someone had been quietly repositioning your future, moving money, drafting amendments, preparing an exit you never agreed to, would you want to know before the plane left the ground? Would you open the binder? Would you check the authentication logs? If this story resonated with you, if you've ever discovered a hidden truth in a marriage, a family business, or a partnership you thought was solid, share your thoughts below. Your voice might help someone else recognize the red flags sooner. And if you believe that justice doesn't always come with shouting, that sometimes it comes from understanding structure and reclaiming control, stay with this channel. Subscribe if you want more stories where betrayal is met, not with chaos, but with clarity. Santorini was never about romance. It was about who controlled the horizon. This time, I chose where the sun would rise.